There are moments in American political history when the temperature in Washington doesn't just rise, it hardens. The air thickens. Lines are drawn not in sand, but in concrete. And in this moment, 6 lawmakers, each with deep roots in military or intelligence service, have quietly positioned themselves at the center of what may become one of the most consequential confrontations between executive power and constitutional limits in modern U.S. history. 3 realities define the man at the center of this storm. He does not forget, he does not forgive, and he does not retreat from a perceived humiliation. For years, those who have studied his political behavior have noticed a pattern, a relentless instinct to retaliate, an expansive interpretation of presidential authority, and an almost defiant refusal to accept institutional rejection. When challenged, he escalates. When blocked, he searches for another route. When denied, he returns. Now, 6 Democratic lawmakers, all veterans of military or intelligence service, believe they may be next in line for that escalation. Their original act was not a legislative maneuver. It was not a closed-door committee action. It was a public message, a social media video addressed directly to U.S. service members. In it, they issued a reminder grounded in military oath and constitutional law. Members of the armed forces are obligated to follow lawful orders, and equally obligated to reject unlawful ones. To many observers, it was a reaffirmation of long-standing military doctrine. But inside the political machinery of power, it was interpreted very differently. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The former president publicly condemned the lawmakers as traitors. The language was not subtle, it was incendiary. Words like sedition were deployed. The suggestion of the harshest possible penalties followed. The tone was not political disagreement. It was retribution. Behind the scenes, pressure began building. Federal prosecutors in Washington were reportedly asked to explore criminal charges. The accusation? That warning service members against unlawful orders somehow constituted interference, perhaps even incitement. It was an extraordinary legal theory, one that legal analysts privately described as stretching the boundaries of constitutional interpretation. But the effort moved forward. A grand jury was convened, and then, quietly, the process stalled. Prosecutors failed to secure indictments. The grand jury declined to move forward. No charges. No courtroom. No spectacle. For most administrations, that would be the end of the story. But this is not most administrations. Several of the targeted lawmakers are not celebrating. They are preparing. Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, a former Navy captain and astronaut, has made it clear he is not taking comfort in the grand jury's refusal. Those who have served in combat zones understand something civilians often overlook. The absence of action today does not guarantee safety tomorrow. Michigan Senator Alyssa Slotkin, a former CIA analyst and Pentagon official, has openly acknowledged she would not be surprised if a new attempt emerged. The possibility of restructured charges, a different venue, a renewed legal angle. Meanwhile, Representative Jason Crow, an Army Ranger who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, has launched a counteroffensive of his own. He has warned that any continued attempt to weaponize the Department of Justice will be met with legal resistance. Documentation is being preserved. Names are being recorded. Institutional memory is forming. And then there is another layer to this confrontation. The Defense Department itself. Efforts have reportedly begun to revisit the military record of one of the lawmakers, with discussions about revising rank status and retirement compensation. It is a move that blurs the line between administrative authority and political reprisal. The implications extend far beyond 6 elected officials. At stake is the foundational question. What happens when presidential power collides with the constitutional guardrails designed to restrain it? When does enforcement become intimidation? When does legal inquiry become political punishment? And how resilient are the institutions meant to absorb such shocks? This is not merely a partisan conflict. It is a stress test of democratic infrastructure. A moment where military tradition, constitutional doctrine, prosecutorial independence, and executive ambition converge. The grand jury's refusal to indict may have closed one door, but in Washington, doors rarely stay closed for long. As political tensions deepen and alliances harden, one question looms larger than the rest. Was this a failed prosecution, or the opening maneuver in a far more calculated campaign? There are moments in American history when political conflict crosses an invisible threshold, when rhetoric stops being theater and begins to resemble a stress test of the republic itself. This is one of those moments. At the center of the storm stands a former president whose political DNA is defined by three constants: an unyielding instinct for revenge, an expansive view of executive authority, and a refusal to accept defeat as final. These traits are not whispered assessments from critics. They are observable patterns forged across years of public battles, courtrooms, campaign stages, and institutional clashes. Now, those patterns are converging with a group of 6 Democratic lawmakers, each of them veterans of the military or intelligence community, who believe they may have crossed a line that provoked something far more dangerous than partisan backlash. Their action was deceptively simple. In a social media video, the lawmakers issued a message directed at members of the United States Armed Forces. The message did not call for rebellion. It did not encourage insubordination. Instead, it reminded service members of a principle drilled into them from the first day of training. They swear an oath to the Constitution, not to any single leader. They are obligated to follow lawful orders and obligated to refuse unlawful ones. In most eras, such a reminder would be unremarkable. It echoes long-standing military doctrine and the legal standards shaped by history, from Nuremberg to modern military law. But in today's climate, the statement detonated like a flare in a powder magazine. The response was immediate and ferocious. The former president publicly branded the lawmakers as traitors. He accused them of sedition at the highest level. The language escalated further, with suggestions that their actions merited the gravest punishments imaginable. The message was unmistakable. This was not disagreement. It was perceived betrayal. Behind closed doors, the machinery of government began to move. Federal prosecutors in Washington were reportedly asked to examine whether the lawmakers' warning could constitute a criminal offense. The legal theory that publicly reminding troops of their constitutional duty might amount to interference or incitement stunned many legal observers. Constitutional scholars privately described it as aggressive, even unprecedented. Still, the process advanced. A grand jury was convened. Witnesses were reportedly reviewed. Arguments were made. The weight of the federal justice system hovered over 6 sitting lawmakers, individuals who had themselves worn the uniform of national service. And then, in a quiet but consequential development, the grand jury declined to indict. No charges were filed. No courtroom battle commenced. The attempt stalled. For many politicians, that would signal the end of the episode, a political flare-up, a failed maneuver, a return to business as usual. But those who understand the psychology of power are not so certain. Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, a former Navy captain and combat veteran, has expressed caution rather than relief. He understands something learned in military command. Setbacks do not always mean surrender. They can mean recalibration. Michigan Senator Alyssa Slotkin, with years inside the CIA and the Pentagon, has publicly acknowledged that another attempt would not surprise her. Legal strategies can evolve. Jurisdictions can shift. Charges can be reframed. Representative Jason Crow, an Army Ranger who deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan, has signaled that he is preparing for escalation rather than retreat. He has warned that any sustained effort to weaponize the Department of Justice will be met with counteraction. Documentation is being preserved. Records are being compiled. And then came an additional layer that deepened the stakes. The Defense Department, led by a loyalist defense secretary, reportedly initiated steps to revisit the military status of one of the senators, exploring options to reduce rank and retirement compensation. In context, critics see something more pointed: the possibility of institutional retaliation bleeding into military record. The implications are seismic. This confrontation is no longer about a single video or a single outburst. It is about the elasticity of presidential power. It is about whether the Justice Department can remain insulated from political vendettas. It is about whether military traditions rooted in constitutional loyalty can withstand pressure from the highest office in the land. A grand jury's refusal to indict has created a pause. but it has not created peace. The larger question now hangs over Washington like gathering storm clouds. Was this a failed prosecution, or merely the first probe in a broader campaign to test how far executive influence can stretch before the guardrails snap? Because in moments like these, history teaches a sobering lesson. Institutions are strongest not when they are unchallenged, but when they are pushed to their limits. And this push may only be beginning. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more updates.